And they're monsters. That's what we get. By the way, I want to thank Jennifer Whitehouse for mentioning Barnum's World. Got a text from Charlie Robinson. Want to talk about their new movie next week. If I can get Charlie on, he's going to be heading up to Porkfest. That'll be great. Oh, Angie, it would be so great. Angie, all of you, if you make it up to Porkfest, that would be so much fun. I would love that. And Dustin, thanks again for your great comments. Twilight Shadow again. Ghost Start, thank you. E-Pigeon, thank you. Yona, Dr. Yona. They call me Dr. Love. Yeah, very cool. We went to like a death rock disco place that was all like goth stuff. And we were able to get the DJ down in Boston. We were in college. We were able to get the DJ to play Dr. Love by Kiss because by that time, like the goth stuff had become so popular for college people. You know, they're all walking around black turtlenecks and black lipstick and stuff. And like, oh, let's do some cheesy metal. And Dr. Love isn't even really cheesy. It's tongue in cheek. It's great. I love it when Gene Simmons goes, yeah. So call me Dr. Love. Oh man, with the high pitch in his voice, it's just classic. I got the cure you're thinking of. You gotta hand it to Kiss. They knew what they were doing, especially when they did their NBC TV movies, Kiss and the Phantom of the Carnival or the Phantom of the Circus or something like that. Kiss fighting. It's like Scooby-Doo, but it was Kiss. They should have had a movie. That would have been great with Kiss and their makeup and Scooby-Doo with CG. That would be classic, man. That's one of those high concept things. And I always think it's funny that they use the term high concept. High concept it's just meaningless. It's just more like George Carlin would say, it's just adding more syllables to something, which is just basically good idea. That's all it is. That's what high concept. If you go to Hollywood and somebody says something like, yeah, man, I'm really into those high concept things. Oh, you mean something that's a good idea? Well, yeah, but I call it high concept because I want to sound sophisticated. Okay, great. Go to Winchell's. Have a good time. I'll see you at Winchell's. Hey, talking about fiction, writing, and all those great things, let's talk about good short fiction. Now, as I mentioned, when we started off the former Star Trek Writing Fellow channel on YouTube, on Rumble, we had the opportunity for folks to weigh in on some of their things as we're going live, some of their ideas about what is good, what is bad, that sort of stuff. And we're going to do a lot more of that. And I get to talk about some of my experience writing on television shows like The Outer Limits and Star Trek Voyager. And then going into prose fiction, how I sort of started as a teenager sending short stories to Twilight Zone magazine and Rod Serling's widow, Carol. She was the publisher, and she would write little notes back to be very encouraging to me. And so I've had the opportunity to have prose fiction published, which has been just great. And I've got a lot more waiting. I declined the contract for one because the company wanted me to go under a pseudonym so that my fiction work wouldn't be associated with my highly radical libertarian, anarchist, voluntarist, agorist output for my writing. So I'm like, no, sorry, it's my name. Why would I be splitting that off? They're like, well, it could harm sales. Whatever, I don't care. Doesn't matter. You'll probably get more people who will come to this small publishing company from my libertarian stuff, who know me from that stuff because I've been doing it for years, than you would lose because of the political stuff. But I declined the contract, and that book is now, it hasn't been published. It's been 10 years. It's the sequel to my novella, Bite. So if you want to check out the novella, Bite, it's cool, I think. It's sort of a Kolchak type thing about a guy who works in a very strange field in Las Vegas. He gets hired by insurance companies and small governments to kill vampires. Sort of a gumshoe detective, like there are others out there that do the same sort of thing. And they have a network of folks who do that. And so he's about ready to retire. He's going to leave Vegas. He saved up his gold and silver, doesn't get paid in anything other than that in cash. He prefers gold and silver because it retains its value. And he's about to leave the next day. He's got a ticket to fly out of Vegas. And he walks into the bar where he just basically has friends of convenience and stuff. And he flirts sometimes with the waitress. And they connect sometimes, but there's nothing really, anything happening. It's kind of sad. He's in his 50s, getting older. His eyesight's getting kind of bad. He doesn't want to kill a human. So he goes to this bar for one final drink. And there's a gorgeous woman there. And she comes up to him as he's watching the news, and he's watching a news report about an empty warehouse that he burned down because there was a coven of vampires in it, a nest of them. And she says, nobody here knows that you torched that place, but I know. And he's like, what? She goes, you just destroyed the thing that used to be my sister, but now I need your help. So she explains that the vampire that had turned her twin sister now wants her. And so she wants his help. And he declines, but then he goes back to his place and he starts to think about it more. And he's got to make a decision. What's he going to do? What's he going to do? What's he going to do? And the story goes on from there. So the sequel to that I actually came up with in a split second when the book debuted in England. I was in Brighton, England. And the day after it debuted, a friend of mine, Michelle, who's from England, I had met them that weekend. Michelle and Dave, great couple. They came down. We're all sitting there to watch a presentation. And she said, I just read your novella. And I was like, oh, hey, thanks. Did you like it? She goes, oh, it was great. What happens next? And I was like, well, nothing. That's the end. She goes, oh, no, you got to have more. And instantaneously, I had literally, it wasn't even a second. I had the entire novel. I knew exactly what was going to happen. It was just, everything was there. I knew everything that was going to happen. It was amazing. And I get flashes like that a lot, which is one of the reasons why I always wanted to write stories, because just that's the way my mind works sometimes, a lot of times. And, and like I almost always can come up with a story and it comes instantly. I know exactly what's going to happen. I often know the ending first and then I reverse engineer it. And so I had the sequel right there. I ended up writing a 400+ page novel that is a sequel to basically a 40-page novella. So that doesn't happen very often. And to get that novel published kind of requires the novella. So the publishing company had to make sure that they could get the rights to the novella. And then we were going to publish the whole thing as one big thing. Originally, we were going to put it out as a series of novellas and then put it out as one volume. So we had gotten that agreement from the publishing company, but then they asked me if I was going to split off, and I was like, no. And so I declined the contract, split my name off and do some other name. And I said, no, thanks. I declined it. And they ended up filing for bankruptcy like a couple weeks later. So like, okay. And I guess they survived their bankruptcy thing, which I think is kind of fraudulent to do because you get bankruptcy protection. You don't have to pay people off. The government gets in the way of that. I think that's not cool. Anyway, so it hasn't been published. So the novella is called Bite. The sequel is called Flight. And that's the second part of what will be 3 stories. And I'm going to work on that next novel coming up after I finish a few things. But I also have another novel that's been completed for a while called Tea Miser, which is based on a story idea I came up with when I was in college because the Boston subway system, which they call the T, is so bad. We just started to imagine it, and we would do role-playing stuff on the trains, talking about how terrible the T was. It was pretty funny. And we did short films like previews for the motion picture Tea Miser. I was Joe Gold, the Tea Miser. And I had a little sidekick, black kid named Token. And yes, that was about 2 decades before South Park. And as my friends will testify. So it's interesting because a lot of this stuff comes around. I had this thing in there called, instead of cash for clunkers, I had tea for trashers, where the government is going to give you a lifetime Boston Tea Pass if you hand in your clunker car, because they want to get the cars off the roads. So yeah, it's like when I wrote that book, the short story called Whitechapel, about 7 years before the so-called pandemic, and I had a pandemic thing going on. They called it the phenomenon, that was like drawing people together from long distances, and once they touched, they started to fuse. And I had the 6-foot distancing thing there, and shops were closed, and all that stuff. I had false flags and stuff built into it. Yeah, it's weird, and it was actually they contemplated. They thought it might have been started by some virus that they created, or some vaccine they created, or something like that. I can't remember. But so I enjoy the storytelling stuff. So we're going to do more with the former Star Trek writing fellow thing, and get your ideas on great movies, great scenes from movies. We'll open it up to group chats. We'll do live viewings of segments of shows to show great artwork, great lighting, special effects, chase scenes. And I'm not all that impressed by actors. I think acting is fairly easy. But some people are pretty darn good when they do a good job on it. So we'll get into some of that stuff, and maybe even some radio plays, talk Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and stuff like that. That'll be great. But right now, I want to offer you the opportunity to delve into short fiction, and we're going to go to Connecticut. We're not going to go as far as the Outer Limits might have taken us, but since I did get the opportunity to work at the Outer Limits, let's go with our wonderful little theme, the control voice for Fiction Friday. And of course, our channel, the new channel, the former Star Trek Writing Fellow channel. Bring it to us, control voice.
There is nothing wrong with your television set. Do not attempt to adjust the picture. We are controlling transmission. If we wish to make it louder, we will bring up the volume. If we wish to make it softer, we will tune it to a whisper. We will control the horizontal. We will control the vertical. We can roll the image. Make it flutter. We can change the focus to a soft blur or sharper crystal clarity. For the next hour, sit quietly and we will control all that you see and hear. We repeat, there is nothing wrong with your television set. You are about to participate in a great adventure. You are about to experience the awe and mystery which reaches from the inner mind to the outer limits.
All right. Excellent. I love it. The control voice. I don't know who that guy was, but he did a great job. So let's think about horror fiction. And if you were a little kid, and even on the reruns of The Outer Limits, the idea of somebody controlling your television set, like scanners, that was pretty scary. That was a pretty scary thing, that they could control the image and you had no control of it. And it was in your house. Like, maybe not cool. I'm talking Tina and I'm going to kill you. So let's talk about a great writer. This is a man who I typically, every year, I used to attend something called NECON down in Rhode Island. It was in Bristol, Rhode Island, not far from Providence, where H.P. Lovecraft spent most of his years. And a lot of New England writers of speculative fiction, horror fiction, dark suspense, and so on would gather there. So that's how I got to know F. Paul Wilson, Tom Monteleone, Chris Golden, Bracken McLeod. A lot of folks would go there. And one of the people who used to attend, I didn't actually get to meet him. He passed away a few years before I started to go. And his name was Joseph Payne Brennan. So let's talk about Joseph Payne Brennan right now, the author of many, many short stories. In fact, Joseph Payne Brennan is the author of a story that seems to have inspired the film The Blob, where, of course, Steve McQueen really got his first attention. So as you can see, he was born on the 20th of December, 1918, just about a year after my father, and he died on the 28th of January, 1990. An American author of fantasy and horror fiction, this is from the lovecraftfandom.com, who wrote a handful of stories set in the Cthulhu mythos. Born in Bridgeport, Connecticut, his works were almost exclusively set in New England. Now, if you read one of my stories called Gorge, that has references to both Joseph Payne Brennan and T.E.D. Klein. And so just something to keep in mind. Brennan's contributions to the magazine Weird Tales only cover a short period between 1952 and the end of the magazine's run in 1954, but include the story Slime, which became one of the most famous yarns to ever appear in the pulp's pages. He is also known for a series of tales featuring the occult detective Lucius Leffing. And it's funny because Wednesday I was talking about E.R. Edison, and the character's name in that, I might have even said Leffing by mistake. It's Lessingham. So the character in that is Lessingham, and it always reminds me of Lucius Leffing, who was an occult detective. And the popularity of Sherlock Holmes inspired a lot of the contemporary writers at that time to create occult detectives. And that tradition carried on, especially as supernatural stories really became popular. Radio would have supernatural stuff. Movies had monsters in them. So that really became something. So the template of Sherlock Holmes met the popularity of some of the monster fans, and they started to combine these things. So you got a lot of that stuff. Robert E. Howard had a character who was actually a Puritan from like the 1600s, who was sort of an occult detective himself. Some of his best stories actually in that arena. So I want to show you again the man I never met, but do honor to a man who passed away. Now, his daughter is also a writer. So I want to tell you a little bit about his daughter. That's Joseph Payne Brennan's daughter. So we're going to head over here. If you go to Wikipedia, they have a pretty good entry on him. And so I'll just read you a little bit of the intro. Joseph Payne Brennan was an American writer of fantasy and horror fiction, and also a poet. I actually have a collection of his poetry, and it's very rare. It costs like $150 or $180. Of Irish ancestry, he was born in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where he lived most of his life, and he lived most of his life in New Haven. So that's why you'll see the character of Lucius Leffing has a narrator for the stories who's actually Joseph Payne Brennan, and they all happen around New Haven, Connecticut. So Brennan is actually in the Lucius Leffing stories. He's sort of the Watson to Holmes. And this story that I'm going to read to you happens in New Haven. He worked as an acquisitions assistant at the Sterling Memorial Library of Yale University for over 40 years. Obviously, a very well-read man. Brennan published several hundred short stories. Estimates range between 400 and 500. 2 novellas, and reputedly thousands of poems. His stories appeared in over 200 anthologies and have been translated into German, French, Dutch, Italian, and Spanish. Brennan's first professional sale came in December 1940 with the publication of the poem When Snow is Hung, which appeared in the Christian Science Monitor Home Forum, and he continued writing poetry up until the time of his death. As a fiction writer, Brennan started out writing Western stories for the pulps, then switched to horror stories for Weird Tales in 52. And of course, Slime came out of that. And they even mentioned Lucius Leffing here. His 1958 collection, 9 Horrors and a Dream, contained the stories Slime and Canavan's Backyard. I have a copy of that. I think it's worth like $50 now. That book is celebrated in an essay by Stephen Gallagher in the book Horror 100 Best Books, which is a terrific one. They approach a bunch of different horror writers, F. Paul Wilson, a bunch of people, edited by my friend Stephen Jones and Kim Newman, who is popular for the Anno Dracula novels, a British guy. Stephen King has called him a master of the unashamed horror tale. And Don DeMassa considers that, quote, his stories were noteworthy for their effective development of suspense and terror without the excesses of violence which characterize modern horror fiction. So that's pretty good stuff over at Wiki. They did a decent job there. And I really appreciate the fact that that Mr. Brennan's stuff is still so popular. And I wish I had met him, but I want to read to you now Canavan's Backyard. Now, if you're a longtime viewer of the program, you know I've read this twice on the show before. It's such an effective story. It's a terrific story. This is from The Shapes of Midnight. This is what publishing company is this? I don't even know. It's Bantam. I think it's Bantam. So this one has an introduction by Stephen King in it. Oh, it's Berkeley Books. This was published in 1980. And so we're going to turn to Canavan's Backyard, page 34. Canavan's Backyard. I first met Canavan over 20 years ago, shortly after he had emigrated from London. He was an antiquarian and a lover of old books, so he quite naturally set up shop as a second-hand book dealer after he settled in New Haven. Since his small capital didn't permit him to rent premises in the center of the city, he rented combined business and living quarters in an isolated old house near the outskirts of town. The section was sparsely settled, but since a good percentage of Canavan's business was transacted by mail, it didn't particularly matter. Quite often, after a morning spent at my typewriter, I walked out to Canavan's shop and spent most of the afternoon browsing among his old books. I found it a great pleasure, especially because Canavan never resorted to high-pressure methods to make a sale. He was aware of my precarious financial situation. He never frowned if I walked away empty-handed. In fact, he seemed to welcome me for my company alone. Only a few book buyers called at his place with regularity, and I think he was often lonely. Sometimes, when business was slow, he would brew a pot of English tea, and the two of us would sit for hours, drinking tea and talking about books. Canavan never even looked like an antiquarian book dealer or the popular caricature of one. Oh, I'm sorry, I misread that. Canavan even looked like an antiquarian book dealer or the popular caricature of one. He was small of frame, somewhat stoop-shouldered, and his blue eyes peered out from behind archaic spectacles with steel rims and square-cut lenses. Although I doubt if his yearly income ever matched that of a good paper hanger, he managed to get by, and he was content. Content, that is, until he began noticing his backyard. Behind the ramshackle old house in which he lived and ran his shop stretched a long, desolate yard, overgrown with brambles and high brindle-colored grass. Several decayed apple trees, jagged and black with rot, added to the scene's dismal aspect. The broken wooden fences on both sides of the yard were all but swallowed up by the tangle of coarse grass. They appeared to be literally sinking into the ground. Altogether, the yard presented an unusually depressing picture, and I often wondered why Canavan didn't clean it up. But it was none of my business. I never mentioned it. One afternoon when I visited the shop, Canavan was not in the front display room. So I walked down a narrow corridor to a rear storeroom where he sometimes worked, packing and unpacking book shipments. When I entered the storeroom, Canavan was standing at the window, looking out at the backyard. I started to speak and then for some reason didn't. I think what stopped me was the look on Canavan's face. He was gazing out at the yard with a peculiar, intense expression, as if he were completely absorbed by something he saw there. Varying, conflicting emotions showed on his strained features. He seemed both fascinated and fearful, attracted and repelled. When he finally noticed me, he almost jumped. He stared at me for a moment as if I were a total stranger. Then his old easy smile came back and his blue eyes twinkled behind the square spectacles. He shook his head. "That backyard of mine sure looks funny sometimes. You look at it long enough, you think it runs for miles." That was all he said at the time, and I soon forgot about it. I didn't know that was just the beginning of the horrible business. After that, whenever I visited the shop, I found Canavan in the rear storeroom. Once in a while, he was actually working, but most of the time he was simply standing at the window, looking out at that dreary yard of his. Sometimes he would stand there for minutes, completely oblivious of my presence. Whatever he saw appeared to rivet his entire attention. His countenance at these times showed an expression of fright, mingled with a queer kind of pleasurable expectancy. Usually it was necessary for me to cough loudly or shuffle my feet before he turned from the window. Afterward, when he talked about books, he would seem to be his old self again, but I began to experience the disconcerting feeling that he was merely acting, that while he chatted about incunabula, his thoughts were actually still dwelling on that infernal backyard. Several times I thought of questioning him about that yard, but whenever words were on the tip of my tongue, I was stopped by a sense of embarrassment. How can one admonish a man for looking out a window at his own backyard? What does one say, and how does one say it? I kept silent. Later, I regretted it bitterly. Canavan's business, never really flourishing, began to diminish. Worse than that, he appeared to be failing physically. He grew more stooped and gaunt. Though his eyes never lost their sharp glint, I began to believe it was more the glitter of fever than the twinkle of healthy enthusiasm which animated them. One afternoon, when I entered the shop, Canavan was nowhere to be found. Thinking he might be just outside the back door, engaged in some household chore, I leaned up against the rear window and looked out. I didn't see Canavan, but as I gazed out over the yard, I was swept with a sudden, inescapable sense of desolation, which seemed to roll over me like the wave of an icy sea. My initial impulse was to pull away from the window, but something held me. As I stared out over that miserable tangle of briars and brindle grass, I experienced what, for want of a better word, I can only call curiosity. Perhaps some cool, analytical, dispassionate part of my brain simply wanted to discover what had caused my sudden feeling of acute depression, or possibly some feature of that wretched vista attracted me on a subconscious level, which I had never permitted to crowd up into my sane and waking hours. In any case, I remained at the window. The long, dry, brown grass wavered slightly in the wind. The rotted black trees reared motionless. Not a single bird, not even a butterfly, hovered over that bleak expanse. There was nothing to be seen except the stalks of long brindle grass, the decayed trees, and scattered clumps of low-growing briars. Yet there was something about that particular isolated slice of landscape which I found intriguing. I think I had the feeling that it presented some kind of puzzle, and that if I gazed at it long enough, the puzzle would resolve itself. After I had stood looking out at it for a few minutes, I experienced the odd sensation that its perspective was subtly altering. Neither the grass nor the trees changed, and yet the yard itself seemed to expand its dimensions. At first, I merely reflected that the yard was actually much longer than I had previously believed. Then I had an idea that in reality, it stretched for several acres. Finally, I became convinced that it continued for an interminable distance, and that if I entered it, I might walk for miles and miles before I came to the end. I was seized by a sudden, almost overpowering desire to rush out the back door, plunge into that sea of wavering brindle grass, and stride straight ahead until I had discovered for myself just how far it did extend. I was, in fact, on the point of doing so when I saw Canavan. He appeared abruptly out of the tangle of tall grass at the near end of the yard. For at least a minute, He seemed to be completely lost. He looked at the back of his own house as if he had never in his life seen it before. He was disheveled and obviously excited. Briars clung to his trousers and jacket, and pieces of grass were stuck in the hooks of his old-fashioned shoes. His eyes roved around wildly. He seemed to turn about and bolt back into the tangle from which he had just emerged. I rapped loudly on the window pane. He paused in half-turn, looked over his shoulder, and saw me. Gradually, an expression of normality returned to his agitated features. Walking in a weary slouch, he approached the house. I hurried to the door and let him in. He went straight to the front display room and sank down into a chair. He looked up when I followed him into the room. "Frank," he said in a half-whisper, "would you make me some tea?" I brewed tea, and he drank it, scalding hot, without saying a word. He looked utterly exhausted. I knew he was too tired to tell me what had happened. "You had better stay indoors for a few days," I said as I left. He nodded weakly, without looking up, and bade me good day. When I returned to the shop the next afternoon, he appeared rested and refreshed, but nevertheless moody and depressed. He made no mention of the previous day's episode. For a week or so, it seemed as if he might forget about the yard. But one day, when I went into the shop, he was standing at the rear window, and I could see that he tore himself away only with the greatest reluctance. After that, the pattern began repeating itself with regularity. I knew that weird tangle of brindle grass behind his house was becoming an obsession. Because I feared for his business as well as for his fragile health, I finally remonstrated with him. I pointed out that he was losing customers. He had not issued a book catalog in months. I told him that the time spent in gazing at that witch's half-acre he called his backyard would be better spent in listing his books and filling his orders. I assured him that an obsession such as his was sure to undermine his health, and I finally pointed out the absurd and ridiculous aspects of this affair. If people knew he spent hours in staring out of his window at nothing more than a miniature jungle of grass and briars, they might think he was actually mad. I ended by boldly asking him exactly what he had experienced that afternoon when I had seen him come out of the grass with a lost, bewildered expression on his face. He removed his square spectacles with a sigh. "Frank," he said, "I know you mean well, but there's something about that backyard, some secret that I've got to find out. I don't know what it is exactly. Something about distance and dimensions and perspectives, I think. But whatever it is, I've come to consider it, well, a challenge. I've got to get to the root of it. If you think I'm crazy, I'm sorry. But I'll have no rest until I solve the riddle of that piece of ground." He replaced his spectacles with a frown. "That afternoon," he went on, "when you were standing at the window, I had a strange and frightening experience out there. I had been watching at the window, and finally I felt myself drawn irresistibly outside. I plunged into the grass with a feeling of exhilaration, of adventure, of expectancy. As I advanced into the yard, my sense of elation quickly changed to a mood of black depression. I turned around, intending to come out, but I couldn't. You won't believe this, I know, but I was lost. I simply had lost all sense of direction and couldn't decide which way to turn. That grass is taller than it looks. When you get into it, you can't see anything beyond it. I know this sounds incredible, but I wandered out there for an hour. The yard seemed fantastically large. It almost seemed to alter its dimensions as I moved, so that a large expanse of it lay always in front of me. I must have walked in circles. I swear I trudged for miles. I know this sounds incredible. He shook his head. You don't have to believe me. I don't expect you to. But that's what happened. When I finally found my way out, it was by the sheerest accident. And the strangest part of it is that once I got out, I felt suddenly terrified without the tall grass around me, and I wanted to rush back in again. This in spite of the ghastly sense of desolation which the place aroused in me. But I've got to go back. I've got to figure the thing out. There's something out there that defies the laws of earthly nature as we know them. I mean to find out what it is. I think I have a plan, and I mean to put it into practice. His words stirred in me strangely, and when I uneasily recalled my own experience at the window that afternoon, I found it difficult to dismiss his story as sheer nonsense. I did half-heartedly try to dissuade him from entering the yard again, but I knew even as I spoke that I was wasting my breath. I left the shop that afternoon with a feeling of oppression and foreboding which nothing could remove. When I called several days later, my worst fears were realized. Canavan was missing. The front door of the shop was unlatched as usual, but Canavan was not in the house. I looked in every room. Finally, with a feeling of infinite dread, I opened the back door and looked out toward the yard. The long stalks of brown grass slid against each other in the slight breeze with dry, sibilant whispers. The dead trees reared black and motionless. Although it was late summer, I could hear neither the chirp of a bird nor the chirr of a single insect. The yard itself seemed to be listening. Feeling something against my foot, I glanced down and saw a thick twine stretching from inside the door across the scant cleared space immediately adjacent to the house and thence into the wavering wall of grass. Instantly, I recalled Canavan's mention of a plan. His plan, I realized immediately, was to enter the yard trailing a stout cord behind him. No matter how he twisted and turned, he must have reasoned he could always find his way out by following back along the cord. It seemed like a workable scheme, so I felt relieved. Probably Canavan was still in the yard. I decided I would wait for him to come out. Perhaps if he were permitted to roam around in the yard long enough without interruption, the place would lose its evil fascination for him, and he would forget about it. I went back into the shop and browsed among the books. At the end of an hour, I became uneasy again. I wondered how long Canavan had been in the yard. When I began reflecting on the old man's uncertain health, I felt a sense of responsibility. I finally returned to the backyard, saw that he was nowhere in sight, and called out his name. I experienced the disquieting sensation that my shout carried no further than the very edge of that whispering fringe of grass. It was as if the sound had been smothered, deadened, nullified, as soon as the vibrations of it reached the border of that overgrown yard. I called again and again, but there was no reply. At length, I decided to go in after him. I would follow along the cord, I thought, and I would be sure to locate him. I told myself that the thick grass undoubtedly did stifle my shout, and possibly, in my case, Canavan might be growing slightly deaf. Just inside the door, the cord was tied securely around the leg of a heavy table. Taking hold of the twine, I crossed the cleared area back of the house and slipped into the rustling expanse of grass. The going was easy at first, and I made good progress. As I advanced, however, the grass stems became thicker and grew closer together, and I was forced to shove my way through them. When I was no more than a few yards inside the tangle, I was overwhelmed with the same bottomless sense of desolation which I had experienced before. There was something certainly uncanny about the place. I felt as if I had suddenly veered into another world, a world of briars and brindle grass, whose ceaseless, half-heard whisperings were somehow alive and evil. As I pushed along, the cord abruptly came to an end. Glancing down, I saw that it had caught against a thorn bush, abraded itself, and had subsequently broken. Although I bent down and poked in the area for several minutes, I was unable to locate the piece from which it had parted. Probably Canavan was unaware that the cord had broken and was now pulling it along with him. I straightened up, cupped my hands to my mouth, and shouted. My shout seemed to be all but drowned in my throat by that dismal wall of grass. I felt as if I were down at the bottom of a well, shouting up. Frowning with growing uneasiness, I tramped ahead. The grass stalks kept getting thicker and tougher, and at length I needed both hands to propel myself through the matted growth. I began to sweat profusely. My head started to ache, and I imagined that my vision was beginning to blur. I felt the same tense, almost unbearable oppression which one experiences on a stifling summer's day when a storm is brewing and the atmosphere is charged with static electricity. Also, I realized with a slight qualm of fear that I had got turned around and didn't know which part of the yard I was in. During an objective half-minute in which I reflected that I was actually worried about getting lost in someone's backyard, I almost laughed. Almost. But there was something about the place that didn't permit laughter. I plodded ahead with a sober face. Presently, I began to feel that I was not alone. I had a sudden hair-raising conviction that someone or something was creeping along in the grass behind me. I cannot say with certainty that I actually heard anything, although I may have. But all at once, I was firmly convinced that some creature was crawling or wriggling a short distance to the rear. I felt that I was being watched, and that the watcher was wholly malignant. For a wild instant, I considered headlong flight. Then, unaccountably, rage took possession of me. I was suddenly furious with Canavan, furious with the yard, furious with myself. All my pent-up tension exploded in a gust of rage which swept away fear. Now, I vowed, I would get to the root of the weird business. I would be tormented and frustrated by it no longer. I whirled without warning and lunged into the grass where I believed my stealthy pursuer might be hiding. I stopped abruptly. My savage anger melted into inexpressible horror. In the faint but brassy sunlight which filtered down through these towering stalks, Canavan crouched on all fours like a beast about to spring. His glasses were gone, his clothes were in shreds, and his mouth was twisted into an insane grimace, half smirk, half snarl. I stood petrified, staring at him. His eyes, queerly out of focus, glared at me with concentrated hatred and without any glimmer of recognition. His gray hair was matted with grass and small sticks. His entire body, in fact, including the tattered remains of his clothing, was covered with them, as if he had groveled or rolled on the ground like a wild animal. After the first throat-freezing shock, I finally found my tongue. "Canavan!" I screamed at him. "Canavan, for God's sake, don't you know me?" His answer was a low, throaty snarl. His lips twisted back from his yellowish teeth, and his crouching body tensed for a spring. Pure terror took possession of me. I leaped aside and flung myself into that infernal wall of grass an instant before he jumped. The intensity of my terror must have given me added strength. I rammed headlong through those twisted stalks which before I had laboriously pulled aside. I could hear the grass and briar bushes crashing behind me, and I knew that I was running for my life. I pounded on as if in a nightmare. Grass stalks snapped against my face like whips, and thorns gashed me like razors, but I felt nothing. All my physical and mental resources were concentrated in one frenzied resolve. I must get out of that devil's field of grass and away from the monstrous thing which followed swiftly in my wake. My breath began coming in great shuddering sobs. My legs felt weak, and I seemed to be looking through spinning saucers of light. But I ran on. The thing behind me was gaining. I could hear it growling, and I could feel it lunge against the earth only inches behind my fleeing feet. And all the time, I had the maddening conviction that I was actually running in circles. At last, when I felt that I must surely collapse in another second, I plunged through a final brindle thicket into the open sunlight. Ahead of me lay the cleared area of the rear of Canavan's shop. Just beyond was the house itself. Gasping and fighting for breath, I dragged myself toward the door. For no reason that I could explain then and that I can explain since, I felt absolutely certain that the horror at my heels would not venture into the open area. I didn't even turn around to make sure. Inside the house, I fell weakly into a chair. My strained breathing slowly returned to normal, but my mind remained caught up in a whirlwind of sheer horror and hideous conjecture. Canavan, I realized, had gone completely mad. Some ghostly shock had turned him into a ravening, bestial lunatic, thirsting to savagely destroy any living thing that crossed his path. Remembering the oddly focused eyes which had glared at me with a glaze of animal ferocity, I knew that his mind had not been merely unhinged, it was totally gone. Death could be the only possible release. But Canavan was still at least the shell of a human being, and he had been my friend. I could not take the law into my own hands. With many misgivings, I called the police and an ambulance. What followed was more madness, plus a session of questions and demands, which left me in a state of near nervous collapse. A half-dozen burly policemen spent the better part of an hour tramping through that wavering brindle grass without locating any trace of Canavan. They came out cursing, rubbing their eyes, and shaking their heads. They were flushed, furious, and ill at ease. They announced that they had seen nothing and heard nothing except some sneaking dog, which always stayed out of sight and growled at them at various intervals. When they mentioned the growling dog, I opened my mouth to speak, but thought better of it and said nothing. They were already regarding me with open suspicion, as if they believed my own mind might be breaking. I repeated my story at least 20 times, and still they were not satisfied. They ransacked the entire house. They inspected Canavan's files. They even removed some loose boards in one of the rooms and searched underneath. At length, they grudgingly concluded that Canavan had suffered total loss of memory after experiencing some kind of shock, and that he had wandered off the premises in a state of amnesia shortly after I had encountered him in the yard. My own description of his appearance and actions they discounted, as lurid exaggeration. After warning me that I would probably be questioned further and that my own premises might be inspected, they reluctantly permitted me to leave. Their subsequent searches and investigations revealed nothing new, and Canavan was put down as a missing person, probably affected with acute amnesia. But I was not satisfied, and I could not resist. 6 months of patient, painstaking, tedious research in the files and stacks of the local university library finally yielded something which I do not offer as an explanation, nor even as a definite clue, but only as a fantastic, near impossibility, which I ask no one to believe. One afternoon, after my extended research over a period of months had produced nothing of significance, the keeper of rare books at the library triumphantly bore to my study niche a tiny, crumbling pamphlet, which had been printed in New Haven in 1695. It mentioned no author and carried the stark title, Death of Goody Larkins, Witch, in old-timey writing, D-E-A-T-H-E, and witch is W-I-T-C-H-E. Death of Goody Larkins, Witch. Several years before, it revealed, an ancient crony, one Goody Larkins, had been accused by neighbors of turning a missing child into a wild dog. The Salem madness was raging at the time, and Goody Larkins had been summarily condemned to death. Instead of being buried, she had been driven into a marsh deep in the woods where 7 savage dogs, starved for a fortnight, had been turned loose on her tail. Apparently, her accusers felt that this was a touch of truly poetic justice. As the ravening dogs closed in on her, she was heard by her retreating neighbors to utter a frightful curse. "Let this land I fall upon lie all the way to hell," she screamed, "and they who tarry here be as these beasties that rend me dead." A subsequent inspection of old maps and land deeds satisfied me that the marsh in which Goody Larkins was torn to pieces by the dogs after uttering her awful curse originally occupied the same lot or square which now enclosed Canavan's hellish backyard. I say no more. I returned only once to that devilish spot. It was a cold, desolate autumn day, and a keening wind rattled the brindle stalks. I cannot say what urged me to go to that unholy area. Perhaps it was some lingering feeling of loyalty toward the Canavan I had known. Perhaps it was even some last shred of hope. But as soon as I entered the cleared area behind Canavan's boarded-up house, I knew I had made a mistake. As I stared at the stiff, wavering grass, the bare trees, and the black, ragged briars, I felt as if I, in turn, were being watched. I felt as if something alien and wholly evil were observing me. And though I was terrified, I experienced a perverse, insane impulse to rush headlong into that whispering expanse. Again, I imagined I saw that monstrous landscape subtly alter its dimensions and its perspective until I was staring at a stretch of blowing brindle grass to roll and grovel at its roots, to lose myself in it as it ran on for miles, to rip off the foolish encumbrances of cloth which covered me, and run howling and ravenous on and on, on and on. Instead, I turned and rushed away. I ran through the windy autumn streets like a madman. I lurched into my rooms and bolted the door. I have never gone back since, and I never shall. Joseph Payne Brennan, Canavan's Backyard. Now, if you're familiar with the show, you know that years after I read Canavan's Backyard, I discovered that years after he wrote Canavan's Backyard, it was such a big success. So many people would talk to him about that story. He wrote a sequel called Canavan's Calling. And it is great. It's a really good story. He must have written it 25 or 30 years later. And he did it. And it's awesome. It's great. Canavan's Calling. That is in some other collections. And again, you know, you think about this story, and what attracted me to the story first was the idea of it stretching off into who knows where, that idea of perspective. And in a way, you might get a sense of, you know, that story Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer that they turned into a movie. A similar sort of vibe, sort of in a way Lovecraftian, but in this, of course, it's not just an extra dimension or some weird phenomenon that you can't understand. There's actually a demonic, satanic, hellish thing to this. And what I think is cool about this is, as an adult, sometimes you can read a story, and I think sometimes your imagination will cut something off and isolate it and say, well, that happens over there. But as a kid, if you're reading a story like that, that can happen anywhere because it makes hell real. And the passages down into the earth, and the orange and the red and the fire and the brimstone, the evil, the underground caverns, whatever it might be that's your imagining of the entrance to hell, it could be right in your own house. It could be in your own dreams. It could be in your backyard. It's not someplace isolated in Connecticut, you know? So that's just one place. What that does is it tells you if it can exist there, it exists. That's all you need to know. That is scary. So very, very good stuff. And again, well executed. I flubbed a couple times. I hope that was okay on the reading. I hope that was good. And we have here, Angie says, next year on my golden birthday, I'm getting lit in New Hampshire with the libertarians and anarchists. We will welcome you here. That would be great, Angie. I'd love to see you. That would be great. Hoping to get to see you before that. That would be fun if I can travel around a little bit. So Joseph Payne Brennan. Remember Joseph Payne Brennan? Again, I want to show you the man who wrote that story right there over at the lovecraftfandom.com. That's PayneBrennan. Joseph Payne Brennan. And his daughter is a writer of fantasy. Let me just check and see if I can find her name anywhere. See if I can find it. Let's see. Yes, he's the father of Noelle Ann Brennan. This is over at Fantastic Fiction. He's the father of Noelle Ann Brennan. Noelle Ann Brennan has published several fantasy novels. So very cool. So you can look for her as well. That's Noelle-Ann, A-N-N-E, Brennan. Noelle-Ann Brennan. Now, before we close off, let's head over into the land of Tower, not the land of make-believe, and talk about the story that I've been working on. And it is going pretty well, I hope. And I think you will dig it. So if you're new to the show, quick update. It's about a woman named Caroline, a man named Paul. The year is 1960. They work for the Forestry Service of Vermont, and it's the end of the season. It's November, and the weather is getting cold. They've actually had some skims of ice here and there, something that I've had to make sure that I've included. And they're going to a place that used to be a very tiny town. Hey, Leo. Hi, buddy. Used to be a very tiny town. I want to show you one of the links is, I don't know if you can see him. You can't see him. Hey, buddy, coming over? There he is. Yeah, he's a big dude. He's not the bigger of the two, but he is a big dude. Hey, buddy. Oh, he's coming up. He's coming up on the table. I'll show you. This is him right here. That's Leo. Hey, Leo. Hey, buddy. Hi. Give him a good hello. Hey, buddy. Oh, yeah. Leo's going to read to you next time. Right, Leo? He's Gardner Goldsmith. That's Leo. Oh, what a good guy. Yes, yes. He's the dude who was getting real sick, and I brought him to the vet and saved his life. So that was pretty cool. So, yeah, buddy. Oh, you can hear him purring. Oh, man. And what's interesting is lynx hybrids don't purr at first. It takes them a while to start purring, which is very interesting. I didn't know that, but my brother's wife was telling me she did some research on that. So, okay. So Caroline and Paul, they're working for the Forestry Service of Vermont. They're going to this place to close up a fire tower that used to be on a hill in this very tiny town called Frenton. And Frenton, Vermont, was closed down by the government decades before, and it was flooded out by damming up a river, and it's now a reservoir. It's very, very big. So they have to take a canoe to what used to be the highest point, which is still above the water. It's in the middle of this giant reservoir and has the fire tower on it. The whole place is closed off, no entrance for people, and there's a big fence around it with forest and stuff and one driving path to get in. So they have to take a canoe, they go across, and it's getting cold, and they're checking to see if anybody has gone in there. And they discover that along the barbed wire around this island, which is all rocks and just some scrubby bushes, that's it, and this metal tower, which is not in communication by radio or anything, and that's it. It's not even in use anymore. But they still have to go check it because it hasn't been torn down. So they're going to put a padlock on it for the winter and stuff. And so they go to check on it, and somebody definitely has broken in. They've broken off the last padlock. They're inside. And they see that there aren't a lot of wrappers of candy or beer bottles, but somebody has written this weird poetry on either side of the south-facing window. So they're like, oh, that's kind of weird. And someone has tied black ribbons to the barbed wire. There are multiple rows of barbed wire that go all around it. And a snow squall comes up, and the canoe gets blown way out into the lake. So Paul tries to go and swim and get it, and he can't get it. He's trying to tug it up, and the cold is affecting him. So in the middle of this terrible snow squall with terrible winds, Caroline dives out there to get him. Now, she's not been very impressed by this guy. He's kind of a pale, small, unimpressive person. But she brings him inside, brings him upstairs, and basically she wraps him and herself together inside this place for the night and builds a small fire that out of some brush. And so she helps him survive from the hypothermia. They wake up the next morning, and they realize that they're going to be there. This is now a Saturday, Saturday. They're going to be there at least for the next couple of days, because she didn't sign the Jeep out when she requisitioned the Jeep. She just grabbed it. Nobody was there. And on the schedule, they see that this check-in has actually been removed from the schedule. So they're going to be stuck there. So he has some snacks, and they start talking about some of his experiences when he was in Korea. And he has a scar on the side of his hip that was given to him by a little kid that his commanding officer, who was a CIA guy in an operation in Korea, he killed this little boy in the night. And Paul actually had been a swimmer, which was something that they used to do, especially in Vietnam. They would open up the torpedo tubes of subs and have really good athletic guys swim from the flooded torpedo tubes. They would swim out from the subs to the shoreline and deliver cryptographic messages and intelligence to people deep inside the jungle. And that was my friend Larry Poss was one of those guys. So Paul has some experience with war, and he's been through some stuff. And he describes, what the head of their team did to this little boy, and how it was terrible. What happened? So then they're like, well, they have some more nuts and stuff, and they start to think, well, he says. He says, seeming to search her eyes for a sign to continue after he says the little boy, or perhaps for permission to stop. Paul hesitated, waited, but Caroline stayed neutral, and he once more peered down, taking a long, hard look at the equally impassive middle floor. I think that's all I'll say. Other than this, the boy fought like a tiger. Other than this, the boy fought like a tiger. He was righteous. He was right. He had a hatchet, and in the short time he had at us, he gave me a taste of what I deserved. Did you? No. It was our dog-loving leader, because the leader also killed the boy's dog. He liked to extinguish futures. Then he went silent. Caroline chewed a few more nuts, and when he seemed to reach some solemn point in his contemplation, he nodded at the can. I think I'll have a few of those now. The spare repast ended far too soon, and Paul replaced the lid, then extracted the other snacks from his pack, lining them up side by side on the floor as Caroline slid more flammable material into the fire. Not a lot, he commented, laying down one more Hershey's bar like a punctuation mark to a sentence composed of nuts, a small box of raisins, a pack of mint chewing gum, an apple, and a row of saltine crackers and paper. What normally would last a day likely would have to hold them for 3. Too bad we can't catch a fish or two, she said. Paul raised his eyebrows and tilted his head. You know, that's not a bad idea. There could be some tasty treats around these rocks. Yeah, but I doubt they'd want what we have to offer. We'd have to dig for worms. He thumbed towards the window. Actually, that's something I do know about. We're on the edge of winter, but it might not be too cold yet to get them. Night crawlers migrate deeper into the soil as the temperature drops, but they stay below the frost line, often 2 to 4 feet, and they enter a state of diapause, making them go still and hard to find, even if you could dig through frozen soil. But we haven't had any period of deep freeze, of course. If we had, we could just walk back over ice. He drew up his knees and rested his forearms on them, letting the firelight play across his grizzled face. The trick here is finding the right soil. And too many rocks around here? Yeah, they like rich soil. They're most active just after a rain. In sandy or compacted ground, you might not find any at all, maybe 3 worms per square foot. And here, it's mostly rocks. But we could dig around in the moss near the landing area, and there might be something. It's worth a try, if just to kill time and work on making hooks and some kind of line. Caroline scanned the mostly bare room. There were the paper clips, but those might be too weak to use as hooks. They could use shoelaces for line. Then her walk around the perimeter flowed back to mind. Hold on, she said. How about the barbed wire? That idea proved difficult to execute. They ate a few more morsels, and he let the fire work on his clothes. Then he got back into his button-down shirt, socks, and boots. They took 2 coffee mugs, and they headed outside. The air had gone still, expressing a cold, breathless, bitter antagonism. The entire forest, the lake, and cloudy sky disliked what they beheld on the tiny island. But the 2 interlopers moved onto the snow-covered rocks, towards the barbed wire gate, and towards the mossy landing just beyond, and stopped at the rows of fencing. Paul studied a line, pinching it in his fingers, and crouching to get it on eye level. There's surface rust, but it's pretty solid. Might prove hard to cut. They stood on a portion of the lowest wire to disconnect it from the posts. Then Paul set about rubbing its corded double strands against the edge of a jagged stone. Over and over, he scraped the rusty wires as Caroline applied pressure to keep the line segment near the ground. When he finally broke through, he got up and walked a few strides, then searched the ground for another jagged stone against which he could rub the wire. He seemed unable to spot anything adequate for the job. Then he blinked and got to one knee. Caroline, did you notice something about these ribbons? He drew the line up to show her as she approached. What? They're not little bows. What do you mean? They're, he blinked, squinted at one in his grasp. I think they're shaped. Whoever put these here, I don't know, he or she made little designs out of them, almost like tiny scorpions. He turned to her as she reached his side. See? And though at first she did not at all see what he meant, on closer scrutiny, she knew he was right. Both loose ends of the bows had been twisted and curved slightly inward, while the little loop had been pinched at its farthest curve, making it rise, almost like a stinger. What the hell? The ribbon twitched above his fingertip, vibrating from the subtle movement of the wire. How many of these things are there? Caroline asked, sliding her gaze along the parallel lines. I'm damned if I know. He shook his head and let it go, wiping away some of the stark white snowpack to expose the wet rocks. But for a moment, his hand stopped, and he stared at the stones and slush. Are you okay, Paul? He blinked, glanced at her in a kind of distracted, nervous way, and continued his movements as if all was well. Yeah, just a little disoriented for a sec. I'm hoping my body will be back to 100% soon. It took more than 20 minutes for him to scrape and bend, rebend, and scrape again the stubborn wire in order to break away a section that was about 15 feet in length. And while he labored to free the line and all its ready-made barbs, Caroline uncovered the moss at the landing point and successfully revealed and caught 5 worms. Dropping them into one of the coffee mugs and stacking the other mug on top. And caught 5 worms, dropping them into one of the coffee mugs and stacking the other mug on top. He came to her, holding the wire in a giant loop, away from his body and up off the ground, and he shook his head. I don't think this is going to work. Don't be so negative. Besides, we have nothing better to do. And that truth seemed to comfort Paul, who smiled, but again pursed his brow at the little ribbons as he settled down on his knees beside her. To her surprise, the idea and the jerry-rigged fishing line worked. It took hours and multiple tries. It took numerous tests and failures and a lot of worms, but after getting over the initial revulsion of piercing, desperate night crawlers on the sharp spikes, and after learning that they had to yank up that line at the first twitch, potentially losing bait for the sake of a catch, they had 2 small sunfish laid on the moss. And they had water and rocks jagged enough to scale and clean the little creatures. What they did not have was a great deal of remaining light. And so at what might have been 4 p.m., they packed the prizes in snow and carried them upstairs to boil or broil the bits of meat and bones over their tiny fire. Ceilings too high, seating too low. What? She looked up from the warm mug in her hand to take in his firelit features, and his lambent eyes returned to his own meal. The ceramic mug and the fork, and the aromatic steam that blended with the dirty, memory-evoking scent of smoke were all around. Oh, England, he said, and brought another forkful of the boiled fish to his mouth. This makes me think of the bad food they have over there. Boiled. Everything boiled. Veggies, boiled. Meats, chicken, soups, fish, boiled. I'd look forward to some of their famous fish and chips when we stopped over after cycling out of Korea, but he shrugged. Boiled. Caroline smiled and ate some more. Are you saying this is actually a meal fit for a king? And he smiled back. Touché. Then he added, better than Korea, of course. We did a lot of fishing there when we could, and when we figured it was okay to make a fire and cook. What did you mean about the ceilings? He chewed, pointed with a fork as if in thanks for her reminder. All the big, drafty old manor houses out in the countryside, they're long past their glory days and occupied by people of much lower means. A couple friends of mine had relatives in those places, and it was weird, kind of disconcerting, like watching slow and unstoppable decay. They had enormous rooms they couldn't care for, with high ceilings, drapes, enormous French doors, unused pianos stacked with newspapers, bookshelves piled way above one's head. They hadn't the cash to handle the places, so they were filled to the gills with dust and clutter and furnished with old couches and soft chairs. And the damn cushions were too low and ratty, so you'd sit in a mausoleum and see the ancient and forgotten or feel the indifference. And then you'd be trapped in a strange sponge of a seat cushion with armrests that rose above your shoulders. Just weird. And that's what I've got. So they're getting a little bit, Angie says, Kitty. Yeah, he's over there. He's at the end of the table right now. And it's funny because, again, sometimes I feel guilty because they're hearing my voice and I know they're expectant. They want me to give them attention because I give animals a lot of attention. You know, like I'm being my niece's uncle. Like if she was around, I would drop everything and just give her attention all the time. You know, I could shift my schedule. I would do whatever. It's the same thing with the animals. So let me show you. Here's Leo again at the end of the table. Yeah. Leo the lion. He's a good dude. So I hope you like the story and it's coming along well. And I think you're gonna dig it. And I see that people are watching over at Rumble. And hopefully it didn't freeze up over at Rumble. I know Rumble has been doing some strange stuff today, so we'll see. Hopefully it's still going strong. Yes, it is. Good. So I'll leave you with that. Hopefully that was a good section of Tower. And right now at 13,500 words. So this could be a novella if I get it up to 30,000 or so, you know, and then short novels around 45,000. But, you know, it just depends on what the story requires to execute the story properly. And again, this week I was sort of feeling like, well, I don't want to drag it out or whatever, but it is the process. And hopefully it's a good meaty thing for you to see, even though I might misread it once in a while. And hopefully that's interesting too, because it's live and you got a guy over here, you know, reading it from my perspective, doing years of writing and being a fan of writing and, you know, really diving in. So hopefully I'm giving that to you. And, you know, Canavan's backyard reminds me of nightmares I had as a kid, seeing witches walking along and shadowy cellars with candles and stuff, weird stuff, trapping me and, you know, all sorts of strange stuff, you know, that terrible feeling, you know, that night terror feeling. I can't get up. They've got me, that sort of deal. Or maybe the thing underneath the bed with its arm that could stretch out forever. I dated a girl one time, just to let you know, I used to have a recurring nightmare that I used to call the machine dream. And it came in two different forms. One form, I was on a red ribbon with black all around me. It was like a red, what would you call it? Treadmill sort of a thing, but it was a ribbon. And it just stretched on, and there was a high-pitched whine that went, wee. Oh, geez, the cat. Sorry about that, buddy. Sorry, the cat's like alarmed. Sorry, it's okay, Leo. It's okay. Probably thought I was doing it. Sorry, buddy. Sorry. Anyway, high-pitched whine. It's okay, Leo. It's okay. Good kitty. Oh, gee whiz. So I'm watching myself turn the camera because I'm watching Rumble on the slight delay. So the machine dream, I would be on this ribbon drawing in towards a needle that was just this giant needle. And I was going towards it, and it was making the ribbon like catch and get crazy. And it was like showing me chaos. It was making the world chaotic and disruptive. And I could tell that disruption and chaos was coming from whatever was controlling that thing, pressing down into it. And it was an evil. It was evil. It was the evil. It was the mind behind the disruption of all normalcy. And then the other dream I'd end up arriving at that. It would start with me in the tub because my mom would be giving me baths, and I hated looking at the drain. Not like I would get sucked down the drain, but sometimes I would imagine like, oh, what if I got pulled down the drain by some supernatural force, something, you know? And I would get pulled down the drain into shadows and darkness, and I would end up in that black realm, and I'd be on the machine again. What's crazy is I dated a girl, actually a novelist, romance novelist named Jill. And she said, I had the same dreams. I was like, what? She goes, yeah. I was like, she goes, I called it the machine dream. I was like, that's crazy. She goes, yeah. It was like exactly the same thing. And I'm like, that's bizarre. And she gets the high-pitched whine, everything. I'm like, that's crazy. I wonder if any of you have ever dreamt something like that. Because that was the worst of all the dreams. Like the thing that was under my bed, I would be like trying to run to get to my parents' bedroom at night, and they'd have their door open and crack with the light on, and I'd be coming from the dark, and I knew the thing was trying to get me, and its arm could stretch and try to grab me, you know, sort of like the tax man. And it would pull me in, and I'd be like screaming, but I couldn't get my voice out, and it would pull me into the bed. But eventually I got old enough that I knew if I just stared at it and told it, leave me alone, or I could kick it, I was all right. Luckily, it wasn't going to draw me into the area of the machine dream, right? So anyway, look, I better go, but thank you for watching. If you're watching this on former Star Trek writing fellow, I think I'm going to keep the whole thing. I don't think I'm going to edit this out and like put it in edit for time or whatever. I think I'll just leave it in. If you want to watch, that's cool. Sometimes people see that, it's a longer video or whatever. Maybe I'll make 2 different versions over the weekend. I don't know. I mean, the Russian staff, the producers and I will do that. But so I hope you check out former Star Trek writing fellow channel. And I see people are talking about the kitty. Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm going to be having, I see Deb says, Kitty looks like Ole did. Ole and Leo. Oh, that's cool. Interesting. Same letters. That's interesting. That's pretty cool. Well, I hope the spirit of Ole, I think Ole did is past tense. So I will say, God bless Ole. And Leo's coming around, just stirring a little bit. But again, he was a stray. He was much bigger because he hadn't been fixed, as they call that. I don't know why people call it that. Yeah, I'm fine. I don't need that. That's not fixing. And he smelled of musk. And then Morris showed up as a stray a couple of years later. And I think they're related. I think they're sired from the same family somewhere. They get along great, except this morning they were fighting at like 5 a.m. I'm sleeping on the couch in Russia. And they were on a little L of the couch, and they're just going crazy. There's this like crazy chaos in the semi-light. I'm like, what is that? Like, wow, going crazy. Like, oh no, it's the boy who drew cats. I need him to fight the rats. Okay, so I better get rolling. Thanks for watching, everybody. I will close off with that homage, that little reference to my great time that I get to have at the Outer Limits up in Vancouver. And I hope you watch the new episodes of Outer Limits were terrific as well. They had great writers. And so check out the Outer Limits. It's great. This is the control voice saying fare thee well for the night. Again, if you want to donate to the show, I got to remind myself to talk about that. You can donate on Rumble while we're live. You can contribute by becoming a paid subscriber at my Substack, Gardner Goldsmith Substack. And when the audios of each show are released on Substack, the PayPal link is there. You can contribute that way. It's very important for me to remember this. Really key. I'm on contract with MRC TV, but it's not a massive contract. It's not a lot. So I was doing a lot more teaching before that, but then I got really sick. So I'm doing this, trying to expand, do a lot more, bring in the writing, get that writing published. That'll be cool. Start up fiction and nonfiction, Liberty Conspiracy Publishing. That'll be great. Thank you all. Have a great night. We'll let the control voice say good night. God bless.
I'll return control of your television set to you until next week at this same time, when the control voice will take you to the Outer Limits.